Keanu Reeves adjusted the grip on his motorcycle as he pulled into the supermarket parking lot. The morning was still young, the air crisp with the lingering chill of dawn. He hadn't planned to stop here, just a random turn on his usual ride. But something made him pause. His eyes scanned the lot, catching sight of a hunched figure moving slowly between the rows of parked cars. An elderly man, pushing a long row of shopping carts, his frame dwarfed by the sheer weight of them. His steps were slow, labored, his breath heavy, but his hands remained steady, his grip firm. Keanu removed his helmet, ruffling his fingers through his dark hair as he observed the scene. There was something about the man, his quiet resilience, the burden in his stance, the way he didn't look up even as exhaustion radiated from him. Then, a voice shattered the quiet. "Earl? What the hell's taking so long?" Keanu turned his head slightly, watching as a sharply dressed man in his 30s stormed toward the old man, the supermarket manager. His arms were crossed, his face twisted with impatience. Earl, the old man, straightened with difficulty, wincing as he adjusted his stance. "Just finishing up, sir," he said, voice hoarse. "Catching up? You were supposed to be done 20 minutes ago. I don't have time to babysit you, Earl," the manager snapped. "Do you need me to find someone younger who can handle this?" Keanu's jaw clenched. Earl didn't argue. He simply nodded, pushing the carts forward with trembling hands, his fingers clutching at the cold metal like it was the only thing keeping him standing. Keanu had seen enough. He swung his leg off his motorcycle and strode toward Earl with purpose. "Need a hand with that?" The old man looked up, startled. For a moment, his faded blue eyes squinted at Keanu as if trying to place his face. No, don't trouble yourself, sir. I've got it," Earl said, with a weary smile. But Keanu had already grabbed hold of the carts, adding his strength to the effort. "I insist." The manager, who had been halfway through turning away, froze. His eyes flicked from Keanu to Earl, suspicion creeping into his expression. "Wait a second. You look familiar." Keanu ignored him, keeping his focus on Earl. "I appreciate it, son, but this is my job. I do it every day," Earl muttered, embarrassed. Keanu tilted his head. "You shouldn't have to." Earl chuckled, shaking his head as they finally lined the last cart into place. "Life doesn't care what should or shouldn't be. You just keep going." Keanu absorbed that. The weight of those words, the quiet strength behind them. Before he could respond, the manager scoffed. "Look, I don't know what kind of stunt you're pulling, but Earl needs to work. Unless you plan on paying his bills, don't get in the way." Keanu's gaze snapped to the manager, his normally calm eyes turning sharp. "Maybe I will." The manager blinked. "What?" Keanu ignored him. Instead, he turned back to Earl. "Why are you still doing this?" Earl hesitated before exhaling heavily. "My wife, Margaret, she has Alzheimer's." He gestured vaguely toward the distance. "The treatments, the medications, the bills. I sold everything we had just to keep up. What's left of our life fits in a one-bedroom apartment." Keanu stayed silent, absorbing the weight of it. "I don't mind working," Earl continued, his voice steady, though his hands trembled. "It's not the work that gets me. It's knowing that no matter how much I do, I'm always just barely keeping my head above water." He let out a breath. "But Margaret needs me, and if this is what it takes, then so be it." A long silence passed between them. Then Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet. The manager's eyebrows shot up. "Look, if you're about to do some charity—" Keanu cut him off. "Shut up." His voice was low, but it carried enough force to make the manager stiffen. Earl shook his head, already raising a hand in protest. "I don't take handouts, son." Keanu smirked. "Good, because this isn't a handout." He handed him a card. "It's a business opportunity." Earl blinked at the black card with gold lettering, John Wick Productions. "What is this?" Keanu grinned. "A fresh start." But before Earl could press for more, Keanu patted his shoulder and stepped back. "I'll see you tomorrow." Then, without another word, he turned, climbed onto his motorcycle, and disappeared into the night, and Earl, standing there in the middle of the parking lot, clutching the card, had no idea that his life was about to change in ways he never could have imagined. Earl stood there for a long time, watching the fading taillight of Keanu's motorcycle disappear into the night. He turned the black card over in his roughened hands, his fingertips tracing the embossed letters. John Wick Productions. He wasn't sure what it meant, but something about it carried weight, like an unseen force shifting the balance of his weary life. Shaking his head, he slipped the card into his pocket and trudged back inside the store. His shift wasn't over yet. The fluorescent lights inside the supermarket buzzed faintly as he made his way toward the back, passing rows of towering shelves filled with neatly stacked goods. Every now and then, a younger employee would nod in passing, but no one ever really saw him. He was just Earl, the old man who pushed carts and stocked shelves, moving through his work unnoticed. As he reached the storage room, the manager, still sour from their encounter outside, was waiting for him. "You done playing hero out there?" the man sneered. Earl didn't answer. He just walked past him, grabbing a new stack of empty boxes that needed to be broken down. The manager crossed his arms. "You got a lot of nerve, bringing a celebrity into my parking lot like it's some damn movie set." Earl kept his voice steady. "Didn't bring him. He just stopped." The manager scoffed. "Well, keep your new friend out of my business. You're here to work, not to put on a show." Earl simply nodded. He had learned long ago that arguing with men like that was pointless. He finished his shift in silence, the weight of the long day pressing down on him. His knee ached, his hands were stiff, and every step home felt heavier than the last. By the time he made it back to his small apartment, he could barely keep his eyes open. But inside, as he walked past the narrow kitchen and into the tiny living room where Margaret sat in her usual chair, his exhaustion melted away. She was awake, staring at their wedding photo again, just as she did every night. Earl knelt beside her, brushing a strand of silver hair from her face. "Margaret, my love." Her eyes shifted toward him, and for a brief moment there was recognition. "Earl," she murmured. His breath caught. Those moments were rare now, so rare they felt like small miracles when they happened. He squeezed her hand. "I met someone today, a good man." Margaret's lips parted, as if she wanted to respond, but the words never came. Instead, she simply smiled, a soft and distant expression. Earl leaned forward, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Everything's going to be okay," he whispered. But the truth was, he wasn't sure what okay meant anymore. The next morning, Earl woke earlier than usual. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. He still had to work, still had to push carts in the blazing sun, still had to make sure Margaret had everything she needed. But something about yesterday lingered. Keanu's words, the weight of that card in his pocket. He pulled it out, staring at it again. Finally, he decided. He had nothing to lose. Dialing the number printed on the back, he pressed the phone to his ear. It rang twice before a voice answered. "Hello, Earl?" His stomach tightened. "How'd you know it was me?" he asked. Keanu chuckled on the other end. "I was hoping you'd call." Earl hesitated. "What exactly is this about?" There was a pause before Keanu responded. "Meet me for coffee." Earl didn't know what he expected when he arrived at the small cafe on the edge of town, but Keanu was already there, sitting at a quiet table near the window. He was dressed casually, a black t-shirt and a leather jacket slung over the chair. When he saw Earl approach, he smiled warmly and waved him over. "Hope you like coffee," Keanu said as Earl sat down. "I already ordered you one." Earl shifted in his seat. He wasn't used to being in places like this anymore. Places where people weren't in a rush, where life didn't feel like a constant fight just to stay afloat. Keanu slid a cup toward him. "You look like a man who hasn't had a break in a long time." Earl picked up the coffee, blowing on it before taking a small sip. "Ain't much time for breaks when you're trying to keep your head above water." Keanu leaned forward. "That's why I called you here." Earl frowned. "What exactly is this about, son? You don't even know me." Keanu tilted his head. "I don't need to know you to recognize a good man when I see one." Earl exhaled slowly. "Look, I appreciate whatever you're trying to do, but I ain't looking for charity." Keanu nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "That's not what this is." Earl set his cup down. "And what is it?" Keanu reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He slid it across the table. This is for Margaret. Earl didn't touch it. I can't accept. Keanu held up a hand. Just open it. Earl hesitated before picking up the envelope and carefully tearing it open. Inside there was a neatly folded piece of paper. He pulled it out and unfolded it, his eyes scanning the words. It was a fully paid medical plan for Margaret's treatments. Earl's hands trembled. I don't understand. Keanu leaned back in his chair. I made some calls, got in touch with the right people. Your wife's treatments, medications, doctor visits, all covered. You won't have to push another cart to pay for them. Earl swallowed hard, his throat tightening. Why would you do this? Keanu smiled softly. Because you remind me of someone who never gave up no matter how hard life got. Earl's breath hitched. He glanced back at the paper in his hands, as if he was afraid it would disappear. Keanu continued. This isn't a handout, it's what you deserve. You've spent your whole life taking care of others. Let someone take care of you for once. Earl looked up at him, his eyes wet. I don't know what to say. Keanu reached across the table and placed a firm hand on Earl's shoulder. Then don't say anything. He smiled. Just take your wife dancing again. Earl let out a broken chuckle, wiping at his eyes. Haven't danced in a long time. Keanu grinned. Maybe it's time you start again. As Earl sat there, staring at the paper in his hands, something inside him shifted. For the first time in a long time, the crushing weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter. He wasn't alone anymore. That night, Earl returned home and found Margaret sitting in her chair, staring out the window at the fading sunset. He knelt beside her, taking her delicate hands in his. "My love," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "We're going to be okay." Margaret turned her head toward him, and for a fleeting moment, recognition sparked in her tired eyes. Earl held her close, his heart swelling with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And somewhere, riding down a long, open road, Keanu Reeves smiled, knowing he had done exactly what he had set out to do: make a difference. The next morning, Earl woke up with a strange feeling in his chest, one that had been absent for years. It wasn't anxiety or exhaustion, nor was it the dull weight of survival that usually greeted him. It was something softer, lighter. Hope. For years, his life had been an endless loop. Wake up, care for Margaret, work until his body screamed, come home, repeat. But now, for the first time, something had broken the cycle. Someone had reached into the murky depths of his struggle and offered him a hand. He walked over to the small kitchen and made coffee, letting the rich aroma fill the quiet apartment. Margaret was still asleep in her chair, her breathing soft and steady. He pulled up a chair next to her, his fingers gently brushing hers as he whispered, "We're gonna be okay, sweetheart." The thought alone made his chest tighten. He didn't want to let himself believe it too much. Not yet. Life had a way of taking things back just as quickly as it gave them. Still, he found himself dialing the number on the paper Keanu had given him. After a few rings, a woman's voice answered. "Good morning, this is Evelyn from the Pacific Care Foundation. How can I assist you?" Earl cleared his throat. Yes. My name's Earl. I was told to call about my wife's medical coverage?" "Yes, Mr. Gibson. I've been expecting your call. Everything is already set up. Your wife's prescriptions, doctor's appointments, and therapy sessions are fully covered. You should be receiving a confirmation packet in the mail in the next few days." Earl was quiet for a long moment. It felt unreal. "That's it?" he asked. "No forms? No hoops to jump through?" Evelyn chuckled softly. "No hoops, sir. It's all taken care of." He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Well, thank you." "No need to thank me," she said. "You have a friend looking out for you." As the call ended, Earl sat still, staring at the phone in his hands. He felt the sting in his eyes before he even realized he was crying. It wasn't sadness. It was relief. Later that day, Earl found himself standing outside the supermarket, looking at the rows of shopping carts he had pushed for years. The asphalt was the same, the sounds of cars rolling in and out were the same, and the weight of routine was still there. But he wasn't the same. He didn't have to be. Instead of clocking in, he walked straight to the manager's office. The younger man looked up from his desk, clearly irritated. "Earl, you're late." Earl placed his name tag and vest on the desk. "Not late. I'm done." The manager blinked. "What?" "I'm done," Earl repeated, his voice steady. "Not pushing carts anymore." The manager scoffed. "You think you can just walk out? You need this job." Earl smiled, a real, genuine smile. "No, I don't." And with that, he turned and walked out, stepping into a world that suddenly felt a little bit bigger. That evening, he went home and cooked a proper meal. Something he hadn't done in ages. Nothing fancy, just a simple roast with mashed potatoes, the kind Margaret used to love. He set the table, lit a candle, and sat across from her. She looked at him, her faded eyes glimmering in the soft candlelight. "You're happy," she said suddenly. Earl froze. It wasn't just the words, it was the way she said it. Clear, present. He reached across and took her hand. "I am." Margaret's lips curled into the faintest smile. Good. For the first time in years, they shared a meal without the weight of bills or exhaustion hanging over them. For the first time in years, he let himself believe in something more than just surviving. A few days later, Earl received an unexpected phone call. "Earl?" Keanu's voice came through the line, warm and familiar. "How does it feel?" Earl chuckled. "Strange. Good. Like I don't know what to do with myself." Keanu laughed. "Well, I might have an idea." "What kind of idea?" Earl asked. "I want you to meet me somewhere," Keanu said. "I think there's more for you to do in this world than push shopping carts." A few hours later, Earl found himself standing outside a sleek, glass building in the heart of the city. He wasn't used to places like this, the kind of places that smelled expensive, where people in suits walked with purpose. He hesitated before stepping inside. At the front desk, a woman in a professional blazer smiled at him. "You must be Mr. Gibson. Mr. Reeves is expecting you." She led him down a long corridor until they reached an office where Keanu sat casually behind a desk, looking more at home in jeans and a t-shirt than any of the executives Earl had passed. Keanu grinned when he saw him. "Earl, come in." Earl took a cautious step forward. "You sure you got the right guy? I don't belong in places like this." Keanu waved off the comment. "Nonsense. You belong anywhere you want to be." Earl sat down across from him. "All right, kid, what's this about?" Keanu leaned back. "I've been thinking. You've spent your whole life working hard, taking care of your wife, doing what needed to be done. But what if you could do something meaningful? Something that helps people like you?" Earl frowned. "Like me?" Keanu nodded. "Yeah, people who are struggling, who feel invisible, who just need someone to remind them they matter." Earl shook his head. "I don't know anything about that kind of work." Keanu smirked. "Sure you do. You know how to listen. You know how to help without making people feel like they're a burden. That's more than most." Earl stared at him. "And what exactly are you asking me to do?" Keanu reached into his drawer and pulled out a folder. "I want to start something. A foundation. One that helps people who are working themselves into the ground just to survive. People like you, who've been through hell but keep going anyway." Earl looked down at the folder. Inside were pages outlining a new initiative, one focused on helping low-income seniors, caregivers, and struggling workers get the support they needed. He swallowed hard. "And you think I can help with this?" Keanu leaned forward, his voice steady. "I know you can," Earl exhaled slowly. The idea of doing something like this, something that wasn't just about making it through the day, but about making a difference, felt surreal. But as he looked up at Keanu, he realized something. For the first time in his life, someone wasn't just offering him help. They were offering him a purpose, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to take it. Earl reached across the table and shook Keanu's hand. "All right, kid, let's do this." Keanu grinned. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." And just like that, Earl Gibson's life began again. Earl sat on the city bus on his way home, the folder from Keanu still resting on his lap. He had flipped through its pages at least 5 times, yet the weight of it hadn't lessened. A foundation to help people like him, people forgotten by time and circumstance. He never imagined himself part of something so... The bus rocked gently and he glanced out the window, watching the world pass by. His old routine felt like a distant memory now. The supermarket, the endless hours of pushing carts under the sweltering sun, it was all behind him. But what lay ahead? Could he really take this leap? A familiar landmark caught his eye, the diner he used to take Margaret to on Sundays, back when money wasn't so tight. It had been years since he stepped inside, but something drew him to it now. On impulse, he pulled the signal cord, letting the driver know he needed to get off. The bell above the door jingled as he walked in. The place hadn't changed. Red vinyl booths, checkered floors, the same smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon. A waitress in her 60s, a woman he faintly remembered from years ago, turned and did a double take. "Earl Gibson," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I'll be damned," Earl smiled. "Still making the best coffee in town, Rose?" She grinned, nodding toward an empty booth. "You tell me." As he slid into the seat, she poured him a steaming cup. "Haven't seen you in ages. How's Margaret?" Earl hesitated before answering. "She's hanging in there." Rose's face softened. "I'm glad." Then she nodded at the folder still in his hands. "What's that, job application?" Earl chuckled. "Something like that." Rose leaned on the counter. "Well, you're too old to be starting fresh. But then again, I suppose you never really had the option before." Earl looked up at her. "You ever feel like life just throws you into something you never expected?" Rose smirked. "Honey, that's all life does." He sipped his coffee, thinking, This is something big. Bigger than me. I don't know if I can do it." Rose raised a brow. "And why'd you come in here?" Earl blinked. "What? You'd had a folder full of opportunity in your lap and nowhere else to go. So what brought you here?" Earl frowned. He hadn't thought about it, but now that she mentioned it, he looked around, taking in the worn but familiar space. The laughter of a young couple in the corner booth, the old man at the counter reading the newspaper like he had for decades, the waitress humming as she refilled coffee cups. He realized this place had always been a symbol of comfort. It had been his and Margaret's escape from the world, a place where life's burdens had felt lighter, even for just an hour. Maybe he had come here to remind himself of something, that the best things in life weren't about what you had, they were about what you gave. Earl nodded to himself. Then he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and called Keanu. "I'm in." Keanu didn't sound surprised. "Good, I already set up a meeting for you." Earl chuckled. "Didn't even wait for me to say yes, huh?" Keanu laughed. "I had a feeling." The next day, Earl found himself sitting at a round table in a large office with Keanu and 3 other people, 2 women and a man, all sharply dressed. Earl felt out of place in his worn button-down and faded slacks, but no one seemed to mind. Keanu gestured to him. "Everyone, meet Earl Gibson." The others nodded, introducing themselves as partners in Keanu's new initiative. A woman named Linda, who specialized in community outreach, leaned forward. "Gibson, we're hoping to work with individuals who truly understand the struggles of everyday people. Your experience, it's invaluable." Earl scratched his chin. "All due respect, I've spent my life pushing carts, not running organizations." The man at the table, a former social worker named Dan, smiled. "That's exactly why we need you. We can handle the paperwork, the logistics. What we need is someone who understands what it feels like to live paycheck to paycheck, to sacrifice for family, to struggle with dignity." Earl exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "And what exactly would I be doing?" Keanu leaned forward, talking to people, listening, finding ways to connect with those who need help but don't know how to ask for it. Earl thought about that. He had spent his entire life being invisible. Now he had the chance to make sure others weren't. He looked around the table and nodded. "All right, let's get to work." The days that followed were unlike anything Earl had ever known. Instead of pushing carts under the blistering sun, he was visiting community centers, senior homes, and food banks, speaking with people who had stories eerily similar to his own. He met war veterans who had been forgotten, single parents working 3 jobs just to stay afloat, elderly couples who had lost everything to medical bills. He listened, he understood, and for the first time in his life, he was in a position to help. One evening as he walked into his apartment, he found Margaret sitting up a little straighter than usual, her hands resting on her lap as she looked at him expectantly. "You're different." she said softly. Earl blinked. What do you mean, sweetheart? She smiled, though her eyes still held that distant fog of Alzheimer's. You walk lighter, like something's lifted off you. Earl sat beside her, taking her hand. Maybe something has. Margaret reached up, touching his cheek. You've always had a good heart, Earl. His throat tightened. He had spent years thinking he was just another nameless worker, another body in a crowd, another old man trying to keep from drowning. But now, for the first time in decades, he felt like someone. Margaret's hand slipped back into her lap, and her expression faded again, her mind drifting away. But her words stayed. That night, Earl sat on the small porch of their apartment, staring up at the stars. He thought of Keanu, of how one moment, one unexpected act of kindness had changed everything. He understood now. Life wasn't about the weight of what you carried, it was about the people who helped you carry it. A year later, the Margaret Foundation for Working Seniors opened its doors, offering assistance to elderly workers, caregivers, and struggling families. Earl was at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, standing beside Keanu as they looked out over the crowd of people who had gathered. You did good, Earl, Keanu said quietly. Earl chuckled. Not bad for an old cart pusher. Keanu smirked. Not bad at all. As Earl stepped forward to give his speech, he looked over the crowd. He saw men and women who had worked their whole lives and never asked for help. He saw young people who had grown up watching their parents struggle, hoping for something better, and in that moment he knew. This was exactly where he was meant to be. He took a deep breath and spoke. My name is Earl Gibson, and I believe no one should have to fight alone. The crowd erupted into applause, and somewhere Margaret smiled. The celebration continued well into the evening. Earl stood in the background as families, seniors, and volunteers gathered at the newly opened Margaret Foundation for Working Seniors. There were warm embraces, laughter, and a sense of something he hadn't felt in years. Community. It was strange, standing there, knowing that his name would be tied to something much bigger than himself. For so long, he had been just another man trying to make ends meet. Now, people looked at him like he was someone important. Keanu nudged him with an elbow. They keep thanking me, but this was all you, Earl. Earl shook his head. No. You saw me when no one else did. You gave me the chance to make something of myself. That's more than I ever thought possible. Keanu chuckled. You always had it in you. Some people just need a little push. Earl looked down at the honorary plaque they had unveiled, one bearing both his and Margaret's names. He traced the letters with his fingers, emotions stirring inside him. If only Margaret could see it. Would she have liked this? Keanu asked softly, as if reading his mind. Earl smiled faintly. She always believed in giving what you could, even when you had nothing. Yeah, I think she would have been proud. The crowd slowly began to thin as the night deepened. Volunteers started clearing tables, and some guests lingered, still sharing stories, laughter, and promises to return. Earl watched as an older woman in a worn-out jacket held onto the hands of a young boy. Her grandson, Earl assumed. She approached hesitantly. Mr. Gibson? He turned, offering a warm smile. Please, call me Earl. She nodded. I just wanted to say thank you. My husband worked all his life, right up until the day he couldn't anymore. I was worried I'd have to do the same. She glanced down at the boy beside her. Now I have hope that I can be there for him without losing everything else. Earl swallowed hard. You've already given him everything that matters, but I'm glad we can help. The woman smiled, squeezing his hands before walking away, the boy waving at him. Earl watched them go, a warmth spreading in his chest. Hope. That was the whole point, wasn't it? As he turned back, he saw Keanu leaning against the wall, arms crossed, watching him with an amused expression. What? Earl asked. Keanu smirked. Nothing. Just wondering how it feels. How what feels? Keanu gestured around them. Being the guy who changes lives. Earl chuckled, shaking his head. I don't know about all that. Don't sell yourself short. Keanu straightened, clapping a hand on Earl's shoulder. You stepped up. A lot of people wouldn't. Earl thought about that for a moment. Maybe Keanu was right. Maybe life had been waiting all along for him to find his moment. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't done yet. A few months later, Earl sat at his small kitchen table, sipping coffee as the morning sun filtered through the window. Margaret's chair sat across from him, empty but still a presence in the home they had built together. The phone rang, breaking the quiet. "Earl?" Keanu's voice greeted him on the other end. "You up for a road trip?" Earl raised an eyebrow. "At my age?" Keanu laughed. "Come on, old man, you've got work to do." Earl chuckled. "All right, kid. Where are we headed?" Keanu paused before answering. "Somewhere that needs us." Earl glanced around his modest apartment, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Excitement. Maybe his journey wasn't over after all. He grabbed his jacket, stepped outside, and locked the door behind him. And just like that, a new chapter began. Loved this story? Click the next video for more, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss our latest uploads.
you.